Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm happy to welcome you to this third session of our fall series on the space in between thresholds and borders in Jewish life and thought. And special welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time today. We're really pleased to have Professor Ben Sommer teaching us again today. You know, when we invite faculty for these series, we invite people we think fit the theme, and they send us back proposed topics. And what's after summer this semester, we just couldn't decide between the two. They were so great. So we said, will you please come twice? And he said yes. So he kicked off our session talking about sort of the inherent incompleteness of the work of creation, God's role and the human role. And so the sort of in-between space we're left in at the end of creation. And today we'll be looking at a very different kind of in-between, I think, around the tent of meetings. So we have that to look forward to. We're so grateful to JTS trustee Yael Aspel for sponsoring today's session at the Navi level, which is our highest sponsorship level. We would love to have more of you consider sponsoring. If you're feeling inspired by this amazing learning with JTS scholars. We have 3 sponsorship levels. Chacham is $540, Tzaddik is $1,000, and Navi is $1,800. If those numbers feel out of reach, you could look around the gallery and see if there are folks that you want to team up together to sponsor. But we'd love to have more sponsors, and that support really makes the series possible. So thank you. All right, so I will turn it over to Tani to give us a bit more information.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format for our session, Professor Sommer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have some time at the end for some Q&A. You can chat your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman, and she'll select a few of the questions to present to Professor Sommer. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link this morning, and we'll be screen sharing them as well. We're pleased to have Professor Sommer teaching us again this week, and Dr. Benjamin Sommer joined the JTS faculty as professor of Bible in 2008. He has written several books which have been the recipients of multiple awards and prizes. His most recent book is Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition. You can read more about his publications in the full bio with the sources. Dr. Sommer has long been active as a lecturer and scholar in residence, teaching rabbis, Jewish educators, and lay people in a variety of settings in the US and in Israel. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sommer.
Sorry, I had forgot that I had muted myself during the intros. Thank you, Tani, and thank you, Julia. Thank you to Yael again for sponsoring this series, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's just wonderful to see a whole bunch of familiar faces from Chicago, from Minyanim that I've attended there, and from really from all over the place, and to see a lot of unfamiliar faces as well. So we're going to be continuing today on this theme, this third session on liminality, on the idea of being betwixt and between in Jewish literature, Jewish culture, and Jewish thought. In my particular case, I'm going to be giving what is a standalone lecture, but it is also a lecture that relates to the lecture that I had given 2 weeks ago, or whatever number of weeks ago it was, because we will again be talking a good deal about the Mishkan, that is to say, about the tabernacle, or the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, that takes up such a very large part of the Torah. The description of the Mishkan is found starting just a little bit over halfway through the book of Exodus. It takes up nearly half of the book of Exodus. And then the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is the location in which a great many events are portrayed in the books of Leviticus and Numbers, the location at which a great many laws in the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers are passed on to Moses and the Israelites. Last time I talked about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, as being the pinnacle of creation, the pinnacle of creation. I suggested that from an ancient Near Eastern point of view, the world wasn't complete until the Mishkan, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, was erected by the Israelites. What I'd like to do today is talk, though, a little bit about an odd feature of the tabernacle as it appears in the Torah, which is that when we read the Torah carefully, we see that there are actually two different tents that are described in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Numbers. A lot of us are familiar with the lengthy description of how you're supposed to build the tabernacle, this tent, this dwelling place for God. And then there's the lengthy description of how, detail by detail, the Israelites fulfilled all those directions. Every single detail that was given as an order is noted in the past tense and in the story of how the tent was built. It can be easy to miss, though, that there are a small number of passages that describe the tent in a very, very different way. So I'd like to begin today by just describing these two different tents. First, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the more familiar tent. That's the same one that we talked about last time. But then I want to go into the brief descriptions that appear several times in especially the book of Exodus, a little bit in Numbers, of the tent with the same name, but it's portrayed in a very, very different way. And as I'm talking about these two different descriptions of the tent, it will be useful to recall that as a modern biblical scholar, I regard the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as having been created by the combination of several originally separate documents. That is to say, as a modern biblical scholar, I don't believe that Moses wrote down the whole Torah. I don't believe that God wrote the wording of the entire Torah. Rather, I believe that there were various groups of priests, Levites, and sages, various groups of scribes in ancient Israel who responded to God's revelation at Mount Sinai by writing what they understood from that revelation. And the basic story of Israelite history up until the entry into the land of Israel, which happens right after the end of the Torah, right after the end of the book of Deuteronomy, that basic history, it's the same history in these different documents, but that history is being remembered by these different groups of sages or priests or Levites or scribes. That basic history is being remembered in a few different ways. Now, we modern scholars, when we talk about these different documents, we talk usually about 3 or 5 main documents. Two of we tend to call them J, E, P, and D. There's various reasons that Bible scholars going back about 140, 150 years use those terms. For what we're talking about today, there's really only 2 of them that I'm concerned with, the E document and the P document. Let me start with the P document. The P document makes up about 1/3 of the Torah. In other words, it's a bit disproportionately present in the Torah. The P document is the priestly document. That is to say, we call it P, or priestly document, because we believe it was written by Kohanim, by priests in ancient Israel. All of the texts that we were talking about in my previous lecture on creation and the tabernacle, all the texts that we were talking about last time were from the P document, the priestly document. So it's the priestly document that is most concerned with the Mishkan or the Ohel Moed, the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. And that's not surprising because the priests, the Kohanim, officiated at the tent of meeting because the tent of meeting, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was actually a portable sanctuary. It had 2 altars, and once it was set up in various places in the wilderness through which the Israelites were traveling from Egypt to the land of Canaan, once it was set up, it was, among other things, it was the location of worship, of sacrificial worship. It's where sacrifices were offered. It's where the not only at the large bronze altar, the sacrifices were offered, but non-animal offerings were also made inside of this structure. So let me pause and talk a little bit about the priestly, maybe I could call this the priestly memory of what the Mishkan was like. I say memory because we think these documents, J, E, P, and D, were written down hundreds of years after the time of Moses. There were probably traditions that were passed on orally that talked about that time period. Eventually, they begin to crystallize more. They're eventually written down. One of them forms what we call the P document. And so priests, we don't know exactly when, in the 900s, the 800s, the 700s, maybe even the 600s BCE, these priests are remembering what things were like in that time period after the Exodus from Egypt, and they're remembering that there was a tent that was especially important. So let me talk about how they remember that tent. To do so, it'll be useful, first of all, just to talk about terminology. The priests used 2 different terms to talk about the tent. At this point, I'm going to actually share screens. Those of you who printed it out on your own or who have it as a PDF on your own screen, you can bring this up. But I'm going to share my screen so that you can all see the handout on my screen. Is that Tanya? Is that showing up now? We all good here with the share screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, so over here at the top of that first page, let me just quickly talk first of all about terminology. The P document, the priests in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers refer to this structure with 2 different names. One is Ohel Moed, literally the tent of meeting. That's a significant term because it tells us that this structure was, in some sense, a tent. It was something that could be erected and then taken apart, moved elsewhere, and then erected again. It wasn't a permanent structure. It was a tent, although it was a very, very large and elaborate tent. It's called the tent of meeting, probably because it's the place where God and Israel met each other. And that was meant in a fairly literal sense. God would speak to Moses from the tent. So God would give messages to the Israelites through Moses, sometimes through Aaron and Aaron's children. At the tent, Moses or Aaron would stand outside the tent to get messages from God. So God met Israel at the tent. At the same time, Israel went to the tent to meet God, in particular when the Israelites worshiped, when they brought offerings to the altars at the tent of meeting. So God would speak to Israel at the tent through Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's family. And Israel would meet God at the tent and worship God at the tent by offering sacrifices at the altars that were located in and directly outside of the tent itself. It's also known in Hebrew in the P document as the Mishkan. The Mishkan, usually translated tabernacle, but literally what Mishkan means is dwelling place, Many of you are familiar with the later term from rabbinic and medieval Jewish texts, the term Shekhinah. The word Mishkan etymologically comes from the same root as the later Hebrew term Shekhinah. Shekhinah is often translated as indwelling or just dwelling or immanence. It refers to God's presence on earth. The Mishkan is the place where God became present on earth. And here it really is useful to note, it's crucial to note that for the priests, as for pretty much all biblical authors, for the priests, God was conceived of as being, in some sense, a physical being, a being who could be located at a specific place in a specific time. It's not till much, much later in Judaism that the idea develops that God doesn't have a body, that God is incorporeal. But pretty much all biblical authors, with maybe one exception, think that God has a body, at least one body, and they think that that body can be located in heaven, or it can come to the planet Earth. From the priest's point of view, the body of God, which they referred to as the kavod, often translated as the glory or the presence of God, the body of God was made of intense energy, something that was incredibly bright, so bright that if you saw it, you would die. That's why the kavod, the presence of God, the body of God, had to be surrounded when it came to the planet Earth by the anan, by the cloud, by a thick cloud. The cloud prevented people from seeing it directly and thus prevented people from dying. So according to the priests, when God comes out of heaven in Exodus chapter 19 and chapter 24, and God is on top of Mount Sinai, the people can actually see God from a distance. God is surrounded by the anan. The kavod is surrounded by the anan, that is, the body of God is surrounded by this thick cloud. The people are at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and they can actually see God through the cloud at this great distance. And the idea that, well, you could see God and not be harmed only because the body of God was surrounded by the cloud and it was so far away up on top of this mountain, that points to the idea that for the priests, the body of God was extraordinarily dangerous. It was an intense energy. They didn't really have a word to describe it, so they say that it was like fire, ke'esh ochelet, like a consuming fire, though it wasn't really made of fire. It was something much, much brighter and much more dangerous. What happens at the tent of meeting is that the God who created the universe wants to come and meet or dwell among God's own creatures. The God who dwells outside the universe, by definition, since God created the universe, wants to come and dwell, wants to lishkon or shachen inside the universe. The God who is transcendent wants to become immanent. The God who stands outside the universe wants to come into the universe. And that's why this tent had to be built in such an elaborate way, following very, very specific instructions. It had to be built that way because this is a tent. This is a structure that makes the impossible possible. It makes the transcendent God dwell in the world that God created. It makes the transcendent God immanent. That's a very, very dangerous thing. That's why we had to build the tent according to God's very specific directions. That's why it's important that the priests tell us, sentence by sentence, verb by verb, yep, they did this one right. They carried out this direction correctly. They did it. Everything was done exactly to code. And when the tent was finished, when Moses and the Israelites had finished building the tent at the end of the book of Exodus, we read that God comes into the tent to dwell in the tent. So let's take a look at the handout on that first text, Exodus chapter 40, starting at verse 33. I'm just going to read through some of this. In verse 33, Moses finishes building the last bit of work on the ark. And then in verse 34, the cloud, the anan, covered the tent of meeting, and the kavod, the presence of Hashem, filled the tabernacle, filled the Mishkan. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it and the kavod had filled the tabernacle. So we've got a narrative here. The Israelites finish building the tent. Moses sets up the last little bit. The next thing that happens is that God presumably comes off of Mount Sinai, where God has been waiting for about 10 months for this thing to be built, comes down the mountain to the bottom of the mountain and enters the tent that Moses and the Israelites have just erected. And when this happens, Moses couldn't actually enter the tent because the cloud filled the entire tent area, and Moses wasn't able to get in there. Then we have a little parenthetical note in verse 36. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, or actually this would be better translated as whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out on until such time as the cloud did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and a fire would appear in it by night in view of the whole house of Israel throughout their journeys. So what we're being told here is the cloud was above the tent. God, in the form of the kavod, this fiery presence, was inside of the tent. And as long as the cloud was right on top of the tent, the Israelites knew, okay, we should stay here. Whenever the cloud would lift itself up, then the Israelites realized it's time to take down the tent. God would enter the cloud, would leave the tabernacle and enter the cloud above the tent. The Levites would come and take the tent apart, pack it up, and then the cloud containing God's presence would lead them to their next station, the next place where they were going to encamp in their 40-year-long journey through the wilderness. God having entered the tent back in verse 35 and verse 36, God then calls out to Moses in the very next verse, which is the first verse of the book of Leviticus. God then calls out to Moses and speaks to him from the tent of meeting, saying, and then we get the laws of sacrifice, starting at chapter 1, verse 2 of the book of Leviticus. And this is all one narrative. God enters the tent at the end of the book of Exodus, and then the very next thing that happens just a few seconds later is God calls out to Moses, who we were just told at the end of Exodus was outside of the tent. He couldn't enter the tent because God was in it. God calls out to Moses, speaks to him, and starts delivering the laws, initially the laws of sacrifice, and then a whole bunch of other laws. This idea that so what we're finding out here is that the tent is tremendously important because it's actually God's home. It's the dwelling place of God. It's a divine palace, a portable one, but a portable palace for the divine king. And so we're getting a sense of the tremendous importance of the tent. We saw that in my last lecture as well. The tent is really something very, very central. It's central even to the creation of the world, because we talked about last time how the world's creation wasn't complete until this tent was first erected. We get a sense of why the tent is central in another text from the Torah, which is Numbers chapter 2. And rather than giving you all of Numbers chapter 2, I've sort of converted Numbers chapter 2 into a map, or well, actually somebody else did, and I just took this page from a commentary on the book of Numbers by a scholar named George Buchanan Gray, who taught at Oxford. Numbers chapter 2 is a long chapter that describes the layout of the Israelites' encampment as they traveled through the wilderness from Mount Sinai to the land of Canaan over the 40 years. They weren't just a bunch of Israelite escaped slaves and stragglers, wandering in a chaotic way. They were organized like a military camp. Different groups were located in different places. And what Numbers chapter 2 it does is it describes exactly how the camp was laid out. Basically, Numbers chapter 2 is a map in prose format. And what we've got here on page 5 of the handout is just a conversion of all that information in Numbers chapter 2 from prose format to a visual format. You'll see that the tribes located themselves at the edge of the camp. So this area on the edge of the camp that I'm showing with my cursor, this was the largest area of the camp. Then a little further towards the center of the camp, we've got different Levitical clans, the clan of Merari, the clan of Gershon, the clan of Kahat. And then in the front, on the eastern side, the sons of Aaron, the clan of Aaron, that is to say, the priests, the Kohanim. And then in the middle of the Israelite camp, there was the area, the large courtyard area known as which is sometimes called the tent of meeting. That is to say, there's a large courtyard surrounded by a wool and leather sort of borders attached to pillars. And then within that courtyard, you get the tent of meeting. I'm going to go to page 6 of the handout to give a better sense of what's in that courtyard. I'm going to make this a little bigger now. Inside of the courtyard, so here we've got the courtyard itself, which is 100 cubits by about 50 cubits. A cubit is about the length of arm from the length of that goes from your elbow to your to roughly your the tip of your finger. So this is not a huge area. 100 cubits by 50 cubits. Then within this courtyard, you've got the bronze altar where sacrifices were offered, sacrifices were burned, a basin for washing, which was necessary along with because sacrifice was a bloody business. And then you've got a tent inside the courtyard over here. So the word tent of meeting actually is used in 2 different ways by P. Sometimes that phrase refers to the entire courtyard, which is bordered by this wool and leather curtain. And sometimes it's used to refer to the structure in the middle. As long as we're talking about the structure, let me just point out that the structure itself was 30 cubits by 10 cubits in size, not very big at all. It had 2 rooms. The front room had a golden altar. That's where you see GA here. I think this may be just a little bit bigger even. It had a golden altar where incense was burned, but nothing bloody was ever burned. Flesh was never burned there. There was a table and there was a menorah. That room was a room that the priests would go to. Only the priests were allowed to go there. In fact, Israelites were allowed to come into the courtyard, and they were allowed to walk as far as the bronze altar where they could bring their animals to a priest at the altar. But Israelites, regular Israelites, were not allowed to move beyond the altar. From the altar back, you would only get Kohanim, only priests. Priests could also enter this room here to offer incense, to burn incense, and to light the menorah. They would also do various things at the table. And then there was the back room, which is 10 by 10 cubits. The back room is where the Ark of the Covenant was located. So this alpha here, this rectangle represents the Ark. There were 2 kruvim, that is golden statues of a winged creature that had the body of, probably the body of an animal like a bull, the head of a human, and wings. So these 2 wings here represent the kruvim on both sides of the Ark. And God's kavod was understood to be dwelling on top of the Ark. So on the one hand, this whole area is functioning as a temple. There's an altar, one can worship here, the priests bring incense and even make offerings of incense inside the building. But at the same time, this is also a royal palace. This back room here is the throne room. No human is allowed to enter the throne room except the high priest on Yom Kippur. Only 1 day a year, and only one person is allowed to enter there. Otherwise, this is the room where the transcendent heavenly God has decided to dwell on the planet Earth. So we get a sense here of the importance of the great importance of the tabernacle, in part because you see literally that it is centrally located in the Israelite camp, in part because you see over here that this is the temple where the Israelites worship God. This is also the palace where the creator of the universe, the creator of the planet Earth, has come to dwell as a king on the planet Earth. One more point I want to make about the priestly picture of the tent of meeting before we move on to some questions and then talking about this other picture of the tent of meeting. Over here, I've given you a diagram on the bottom of page 6, a diagram of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, located on what we Jews call Har Habayit, what Muslims called Haram al-Sharif, was located in a large courtyard. We don't know the exact size of the courtyard actually in Solomon's time. We know how big it was in King Herod's time, but we don't know, it was smaller in King Solomon's time and throughout the entire First Temple period. We know that there was a huge bronze altar, 10 basins of water, along with another large basin of water. And then there was the building itself. The building had a porch, which is over here. This rectangle is the porch where it says P. There were also storage rooms surrounding the structure, which are these rooms over here where I'm putting the arrow, where I'm putting my cursor. But the actual structure of the temple itself is the area that I'm describing right now with my cursor, is this area in which there was an outer room, which was 40 cubits by 20 cubits in size, and then a back room, an inner sanctum, which was 20 cubits by 20 cubits. And you can see that if we ignore the porch and we ignore the storage areas outside, the main building of the temple itself that Solomon built is exactly like the priestly sanctuary, the priestly sanctuary, the priestly Mishkan. It's twice as big. This is 60 cubits altogether by 20 cubits, as opposed to 30 by 10, but the proportions are identical. You've got a bronze altar outside, one or more than one basin of water. You've got either a table and several menorahs, or a table and a menorah in the priestly tabernacle, or several menorahs and one table in the temple, a golden altar, all that's in the outer room, and then the ark and the kruvim in the inner room, the inner sanctuary, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, also known as the Devir in Hebrew. So that the sanctuary that Moses built, the Mishkan, was eventually replaced by the temple, the Mikdash, that Solomon built. And they are clearly related structures. The sanctuary, the Mishkan, Moses' sanctuary, is the prototype, you might say, of the temple of that Solomon built. I'd like to move on to talk about the way that E remembers the sanctuary. But first, I'd like to stop and get questions right now on the priestly tabernacle. The priestly tabernacle where God lives, it's important because it's God's palace. It's also important because it's where the sacrifices are offered. It's central to the religious imagination of the ancient Israelites. It's also literally central. It's located right in the middle of the Israelites' camp. Let me pause and get questions just going this far before we move on to this other conception of or recollection of the tabernacle or of the tent that we get in other parts of the Torah. So Julia, do we have some questions that have come in already?
We do. Thank you. Okay, so someone was asking, I'm just going to read how this person wrote. I'm surprised to hear of the early belief that God could be someplace with the implication of one place only. For example, this person writes, I had always pictured that God could choose to be in the Anan, the cloud, but was simultaneously in other places too. So is Professor Sommer saying that when God comes into the cloud or into the tent of meeting, God is not anywhere else at that time?
I think that that's a great question. Honestly, someone should write a book about that, and I did. The bodies of God in the world of ancient Israel. Basically, what we're doing today is chapter 4 of that book, and there I explained that different Israelite authors had different answers to that question. Especially within the Pentateuch, within the 5 books of Moses, the J and E documents were written by scribes and sages who would say that God was literally present in some places, but God could literally be present at more than one place at a time. In other words, for those authors, God differed from human beings, not in that we have a body and God doesn't have a body, but rather because we have one body and God can have as many bodies as God wants to have. So I think that for those authors, God could be literally simultaneously at multiple places on the planet Earth, as well as remaining simultaneously in heaven. But for the priests, and also for the authors of Deuteronomy, whom we're just not discussing today, for the priests, it was important to believe that God had only one body. And for the priests, they believed that that body was in heaven until God decided to come to the planet Earth. And then God spent about close to about 900 years dwelling first in the tabernacle and then in Solomon's temple. And then God decided to go back to heaven because of the sinfulness of the Israelites. But God was located in one place on the planet Earth, according to the priests. Now, the fact that God is in only one place at one time doesn't limit God's ability to perceive anything in the entire universe. God can hear anything anywhere. God can see anything anywhere. God can affect anything anywhere. God is still omniscient and omnipotent. But God, for the priests, in the way that the priests understood God, God was located in one particular place. And that particular place was initially the tabernacle after God left heaven, and then the Temple of Solomon. Yeah, great question.
Okay.
Well, actually,
Yeah.
I should just notice that's very, very different, I think, from the way that most of us think of God. Most of us think of God as being located literally nowhere. God isn't a physical being, so God isn't in a particular place at a particular time. But that's a view of God that really doesn't become standard in Judaism until Maimonides makes that view a much more standard view. But when Maimonides was making that argument, it really was an argument he had to make. Prior to Maimonides, there were a few Jewish thinkers who thought God didn't have a body, but most Jewish thinkers did think that God had either a body or possibly many bodies. Very different, I think, than the way that we modern Jews, and by modern for a Bible scholar, anything since about the 13th century CE, that's modern from my point of view. That's very different from the way that we modern Jews conceptualize God. Yes, I'm sorry, keep on going, Julia, sorry.
So just to push on this a little bit, just because I think it's, you know, a reframing for a lot of people. So one person said, isn't it possible that that when the text is referring to the kavod, to the presence of God, or to God having a body, that the person invoked this principle of Dibrat Torah B'lashon Bnei Adam, that the Torah is speaking in, you know, language that we humans can understand. So I know you've just explained at length why, you know, why you think we're talking for real, but just to kind of help people along with this concept, how would you respond to that?
Yes, I think Maimonides would explain the text of the Torah exactly that way. Maimonides actually does invoke that famous saying of Rabbi Ishmael from rabbinic literature to explain why the Bible seems to portray God as having a body, even though really God doesn't have a body. The question is, did the biblical authors understand themselves to be speaking symbolically or using human terminology rather than, frankly, meaning what they say? Given how frequently biblical authors refer to the embodied nature of God, how frequently they talk about God as being in a particular place, and given the fact that they never ever deny that God has a body, with maybe one exception, the author of the last part of the book of Isaiah may actually make such a claim, but otherwise no biblical author ever makes the claim, and for that matter, no rabbinic author ever makes the claim that God is not a physical being. The first time we see someone making that claim in Jewish intellectual history is in about the 1st century, when the Jewish philosopher Philo makes that claim, and that claim goes nowhere. Jews don't continue reading Philo, they don't study Philo, they don't consider him to be authoritative or sacred. Most Jews don't have any idea who Philo was. Then that idea comes back under the influence of Muslim philosophy and Greek philosophy that we Jews knew in Arabic translation. It comes back, let's say, in about the time of Sadia, about the year 1000 or the 10th century CE. A few centuries later, that idea becomes much, much more important for Maimonides. He argues for it really strongly. And then we get denials that God has a body. Many of us go to shul every Saturday and we sing, Ein lo demut haguf ve'eino guf. God doesn't have a body and he is not a body. But that summary of Maimonides' 13 principles, we don't get statements like that anywhere in the Bible. So no, I think that when the Bible talks about God as having a body, I think the biblical authors meant exactly what they said.
Thank you. There are a lot of really specific questions about different aspects of the floor plan and the architecture, which I wish we could unpack all of them. But let me ask this, because a few people asked about the idea that they've heard that the Mishkan or parts of it, did it actually end up in Solomon's temple? And they were sort of asking more also about like how similar were the different pieces in the two different places. Do we have the same ark? Are the kruvim over it the same? And if they're different, what's that about? Was does God now want a different kind of home, or what explains the differences?
Gotcha. So the temple in some ways compared to the tabernacle, the temple in some ways was different and in some ways the same. The material was very, very different. It was built of stone. It was a more permanent structure rather than being a very elaborate tent that could be set up and set down. That having been said, as tents go, this was a pretty fancy tent. There's a lot of metal, a lot of gold, a lot of precious stones in it. It was a very, this is not what you take to go camping. It was a pretty impressive and expensive tent. There is evidence, by the way, from the late Bronze Age that such tent sanctuaries actually did exist. I think it's such an elaborate tent that you can get the idea that this has got to be fiction. There couldn't have really been a tent made not only of wool and leather, but also of metal and wood. But we actually do have evidence that such tents did function in northwestern Mesopotamia in the late Bronze Age, which would be about the exact same time as this tent was supposedly erected, and some of the terminology of these Mesopotamian tents is the same term. The terminology of the materials that went into producing the Mesopotamian tents, some of it is the exact same terminology that we see in the descriptions of the ark. So it's actually a believable picture, but still, it was a pretty elaborate tent. But the materials were different. But on the other hand, I think that the basic idea is that God still wanted the same floor plan. The materials are different, but the floor plan is pretty much identical. The temple is simply bigger. Okay, so once it's bigger, you need more menorahs, you need a bigger, the population has grown, you need a bigger altar. But basically, it's the same sort of thing on a slightly larger and more permanent scale. What happened to the tent once this was erected is actually a mystery. The Bible doesn't tell us. A biblical scholar named Richard Elliott Friedman has an argument that it was actually then located inside the temple. Remember that which most Israelites would never have seen, since only priests were allowed to enter the actual physical structure of the temple. Only Kohanim could go in there. Regular Israelites never went in there. His proposal is that the tabernacle wasn't destroyed or buried or anything, that it was actually located inside the temple. I don't know that most biblical scholars agree with that theory, but it's an interesting theory. And otherwise, we don't know. As for the ark, it's the same ark. It's the exact same ark. Although the positioning of the kruvim is a little bit different, but otherwise, it's the same ark.
I cannot help but share a comment that just is making me laugh. I don't know if you know this term, Professor Sommer, but when you were talking about the fanciness of the tent, someone said God was glamping. If anyone knows what glamping is.
I have no idea what the word glamping is. So
glamorous camping, basically.
Oh, glamping. Cool. Yeah. That's perfect. Yeah. Excellent. And actually, I think I see Joel T. Bloom from Chicago out there. I think it was from Joel that I first heard of the idea that the Torah scroll has a lot of bling. Joel, I think that was you. You can go into chat and tell me if I'm remembering correctly, which is a perfect word for what we do with the Torah scroll when we put all those crowns on it. And the Torah scroll is, I think, itself an echo of the Ark of the Covenant. And so the word bling, I think, is appropriate in this context as well. Bling and glamping, they seem to go together. So I just wanted to tie that knot.
Do you want to take any more? Do you want to move on?
Let's do one more and then let's move on.
Okay. So, yeah, again, there's so many kind of fascinating but very, very detailed questions here. So maybe just to stick with the larger theme that we've been focused on in this set of questions. We have the pasuk v'asili mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. The Israelites should make me, God, a holy place so that I can dwell b'tocham among them. So which is it's a verse that we make a lot of in commentaries and in sermons, that it's not about the place, it's about God dwelling among the people. So just since it's a verse that we love so much in that way, I wonder how you would comment on that. Someone asked, in the context
Great.
we're talking about.
That one, I want to hold that one off until we get a little bit further, because that you just raised the crucial question: is God's dwelling about place, or is it about people? And I actually want to come back to that, but I want to come back to that after introducing a few other biblical passages. So maybe I'll go on now to the E document, and Julia, you might just keep on. Maybe we'll come back to some of these questions. You'll choose other ones, but I'm going to share screen again. Share screen. Wait, why is share screen? There we go. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to what I'm calling the E document. Modern biblical scholars, as I said before, believe that the Torah was put together from a number of originally separate documents. Some of us refer to one of those documents as the E document, or the Elohistic document. It's much shorter. The amount of material that comes from the E document is much smaller, and it refers to something that it calls the tent of meeting only a few times. It does so. The E picture of the tent of meeting doesn't get nearly as much space in the Torah, and so some of you who go to services or have read the Torah, you might not have really noticed it because it's only showing up a few times, and you might not have noticed what I'm about to point out. But when you take all the E passages that talk about the tent, it becomes evident that E is imagining the tent to have been very, very different from what P is imagining. Or to phrase this differently, E's historical memory of the tent that the Israelites used when they went through the wilderness is a very different memory from P's memory. And which of these two memories is more accurate, we have absolutely no way of ever knowing. But let me just run through some of the E texts so that you get a sense of how E describes it. It's first described in a passage in Exodus chapter 33, verses 7 through 11. So I'm just going to quickly read through this passage. We're told here that Moses would take the tent and pitch it outside the camp at some distance from the camp. It was called the tent of meeting, or he called it the tent of meeting, and whoever sought the Lord would go out up to the tent of meeting that was outside the camp. Now, this one verse is very, very interesting, because on the one hand, it's got the same name, Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, and it's associated again with Moses. But instead of being central, instead of being inside the exact center point of the Israelite camp, we're told that it was outside the camp at some distance from the camp. And it's interesting that verse 7 says that twice. Really, it says outside the camp, at some distance from the camp, and then it says it again outside the camp at the end of that verse. It's as if though the E author knows that there are other people who have a different historical memory of the tent, according to which it was inside the tent, and it's like E wants to say this a few times. Why is E being redundant here? Yeah, we know it was outside the camp. You just told us like 3 seconds ago that it was outside the camp. Well, I think that E needs to emphasize this because E knows that those Kohanim, they think it was inside the camp. So this is a very different memory. It's not central, it's peripheral. Furthermore, it's not this big elaborate structure. It's something that Moses was able to pitch himself. Moses would take the tent and he would go outside and pitch it. He would literally throw the tent up. That's the Hebrew idiom is to throw. Well, I guess pitch means throw really in English. So, a man who's in his 80s, he could go out of the camp and he could put it up himself. It was not this gigantic, elaborate structure. We're told in verse 9 that whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance to the tent while he, that is God, spoke to Moses. Well, if the pillar of cloud is descending to the tent, this is also very different from P's memory of the tent, because P P describes the cloud. P doesn't use the term pillar, but P describes the cloud, and it's the same Hebrew word, anan. P describes the cloud as having come down onto Mount Sinai 3 months after the Exodus. 10 months later, it goes into the Mishkan, it goes into the tabernacle, and basically it stays there apparently for the entire rest of the Torah, and then for the entire rest of Israelite history until Solomon builds the temple. And then it is transferred into the temple, and it remains in the temple until the Babylonians, until shortly before the Babylonians destroy the temple in the year 586 BCE. So for P, I think, and scholars do debate this is a debatable point, but I think that for P, the presence of God remained in the tabernacle permanently. It wasn't popping in and out. But for E, no, God lives up in heaven, but God would occasionally pop into the tent to chat with Moses, and then God would go back. This verse, yered, this verb, excuse me, yered, that the pillar would descend, I think is very, very important here. It's, in other words, the tent is not where God usually lives. In fact, God couldn't live there usually because Moses goes and pitches the tent over and over again. We're told that Moses would take the tent and pitch it outside the camp. The Hebrew verbs here, these are what are known as imperfect verbs, which in biblical Hebrew can describe a repeated action in the past. And then we get what's known as a converted perfect verb, for those of you who know biblical Hebrew, which again can describe repeated action in the past. So it's not that they erected it and God stayed there for days or for weeks or for months. No, this was a much more temporary thing. This tent is described again in Numbers chapter 11. In Numbers chapter 11, where we're told that that God decided that 70 of Israel's elders should also become prophets. And for that to happen, it's necessary for them to go to the tent of meeting. And he describes how this happens. So they have to leave the camp. They leave the Israelite camp. They go out to where the tent of meeting is. Then God is going to come down and speak with Moses there, and God will take some of Moses' ruach, which is something that makes Moses into a prophet. God will take some of Moses' ruach and put it upon these 70 elders, and they will become they'll become prophets. Again, notice the verb yarad, v'yaradati. I'm going to come down. So God is up in heaven, but for this event, God's going to come down to the tent. God's going to do something and make the 70 elders into prophets. And it's interesting that on the one hand, to become a prophet, you've got to be apparently in a sacred space. You've got to go out to the tent where God meets with humanity or meets with Moses. That's, at least to become a prophet, that's where you've got to be. If you stop and think about it, other prophetic scenes that describe how a person becomes a prophet, several of them seem to happen in some specifically sacred place. So there's an idea that you've got to be in the sacred place to become a prophet, but that sacred place is not located inside the Israelite camp. It's outside the camp at some distance from the camp in the wilderness. So on the one hand, you've got to be in the sacred place, but the sacred place is not central, it's peripheral. And yet there were two people, for some reason, named Eldad and Medad, who were supposed to go out. They were on the list of the 70, but for whatever reason, they remained in the camp. And surprisingly, even though they hadn't gone out to the sacred place, they did become prophets. They spoke in ecstasy inside the camp. Vayitnaba'u b'machaneh is what the Hebrew has there. And then somebody comes out and tells Moses, this weird thing's happening back in the camp, that these people, these two guys have become prophets, even though they're not out here in the sacred place, they're back in the camp. And Joshua, Moses' sidekick, who actually, he's the one who stays at the tent of meeting when Moses isn't there, Joshua speaks up and says, my Lord Moses, shut them up. And Moses, apparently, in other words, Joshua thought this is improper. How can you be becoming a prophet in the wrong place? You've got to become a prophet here in an orderly fashion. This is dangerous if people are becoming prophets not in the right place, not in the right way. So Joshua seems to be upset, but Moses said, What, are you jealous on my behalf? I wish that all of Hashem's people were prophets, that God put his spirit on all of them, not just on these 68 that are out here by the tent and those 2 that are still back in the camp. And so there's some idea here that, well, no, prophecy could happen anywhere. In fact, it would be a good thing if it could happen everywhere. Although that's apparently not realistic, but that's at least an ideal that Moses suggests here. I'm only giving you 2 out of really 3 or 4 passages in which somebody, in which we get a reference to the tent of meeting that E describes. What's interesting to me as a scholar of religions is I think that the Torah, in recording or in including 2 different historical memories of what the Ohel Moed was, where the Ohel Moed was, and how it functioned, it's giving us 2 very, very different views of what religion is all about. And a variety of scholars of comparative religion have talked about 2 different types of religion. Especially, there's a very, very famous scholar of religions known, his name was Mircea Eliade, and he talked about there being these 2 different types of religion. He thought one of them was earlier and the other came later. Then another scholar, also like Eliade, a professor at the University of Chicago, although a few decades later, a scholar named Jonathan Z. Smith, J.Z. Smith, adapted Eliade's theory and said, we've got these 2 different kinds of religion, but they're not early and late. They can coexist. They can be present in the same culture at the same time, even in the same religion at the same time. And I think that that's what we're getting in the Torah. So I'd like to use some of Eliade and especially Smith's terminology to describe the 2 tents that we've got, because the way that Smith and Eliade describe two conceptions of religion, 2 types of religion, really matches these 2 different tents that we get in the Torah. In one type of religion, the sacred is located in the middle. It's located in the center. And so the center is where religion happens, where religious authority is available, where God is available, and there's one particular center. There's one holy mountain or one temple, and in that case, there's often one main religious authority. That center tends to be permanent. It's ongoing. God is available there, and God is, in a way, dangerous and yet user-friendly. Although God might be dangerous, God has made God's self available and user-friendly, because although God might in essence be transcendent, God has decided to dwell on the planet Earth and to be therefore immanent. So we know where God is. We know where to go find him. We know who the authorities are that have a close connection to God. We know, in a sense, for this point of view, God is powerful, but God has allowed God's self to be domesticated, to have a domicile, to have a particular place where God is found, where God is available, and therefore in a way where God is predictable. We know that twice a day we can go meet God. In fact, we have to go meet God as a nation by offering the sacrifices every morning and every evening. Of course, we don't literally, all of us go to do that. The Kohanim do that on our behalf. But the nation Israel can meet God every single morning, every single evening when the Tamid offering is given. So that there's a relationship with God that becomes possible in this point of view, there's a relationship with God which is predictable, and it's predictable in part because it's located in a particular place. So Smith in particular uses the word locative to describe this way of understanding God. For this way of understanding God, God is present in a place. Place matters a lot. Sacrality, holiness, is something that can inhere in a place. And therefore, the whole religion can become very much oriented towards sacred place within a community. And there's one central authority. There are Kohanim, there is a Kohen Gadol, there is a high priest We know who he is, and he can speak authoritatively. He can give us the law. He can interpret the law authoritatively. That's one kind of religion, and that's the kind of religion that we're seeing in the priestly document. The priestly document represents what J.Z. Smith would call a locative view of religion. He also calls it a centripetal view of religion. This is also what Mircea Eliade, whom Yael Asbel, who's sponsoring the series, is very interested in, I know, in Eliade's work. This is also what Mircea Eliade would call an archaic religion. But there's this other kind of religiosity, this other kind of religious intuition in the world that emphasizes not the center, but the periphery. It emphasizes, no, God isn't available amongst us in a particular place. God is out there. God is mysterious and unpredictable. We don't know where to look for God. And so God is going to be located in the wilderness. There isn't one center where God is located. If God is somewhere, well, in some sacred center, in that case, there will be many sacred centers. There are going to be lots of places where God is available, but in a temporary way. God isn't reliably available there in any of these sacred centers, because God just pops in and pops out. Just like we see that for E, it's not that God came to shachen, to dwell in the tent and to live there for hundreds and hundreds of years. No, God would pop in, talk to Moses, and pop back out. God's presence might be available on the planet Earth, but it's only temporary. And that's because God is fundamentally transcendent and not immanent. And because God is transcendent, God is unpredictable. If that's the case, then God isn't in one particular location. He's not in one topos, to use the Greek term for place. God is not limited to place. That is to say, God is utopian. Utopos would mean no place. God is not located in one location. And so this other sort of religiosity would be called a utopian form of religiosity. For this form of religiosity, place matters a whole lot less. This form of religiosity might warn you, if you've got sacred spaces, that could easily devolve into idolatry. So you better watch out for the idea of sacred space, because that's a dangerous idea. Place is not that important. In fact, place might be a dangerous concept religiously. And therefore, you see that E is an example of this more utopian model of religiosity, because E locates the tent not in civilized Israelite society, not in the encampment where the Israelites live, but out in the wilderness at some distance from the camp. In other words, it's in an area of chaos, not in an area of civilizations. And at least as an ideal, we get the idea that there could be many religious authorities rather than one religious authority. Remember that back in verse 29 of Numbers chapter 11, when Joshua hears that there are these two guys who didn't follow the directions, who didn't come out to the tent to become prophets in the right place, in the right way, they're back in the wrong place becoming prophets. And Joshua then says to Moses, Adoni Moshe Klaim, which I would translate it as, my Lord Moses, shut them up or restrain them, is what New JPS uses here. But Moses responds, Hamikaneh, are you jealous on my behalf? I wish that all the Lord's people were spirits, that God put were prophets, that God put his spirit on all of them. So in the utopian view of religion, there is at least an ideal that there should be many authorities. Maybe there really aren't. It's just two guys back there. It's not that many of them. But the ideal should be that, no, I'm not the only leader, that everybody could be a religious leader. There's an idea of spreading authority further out. Whereas the P view of religion, and which is represented by P's view of the tent, is one that emphasizes the center, emphasizes structure. The E view of religion in the E tent is one that emphasizes what scholars of religion and anthropologists of religion have called the liminal. Instead of emphasizing the center and structure, E emphasizes places that are betwixt and between, not part of civilization, out in the wilderness. And E emphasizes the idea of a breakdown of structure. First of all, the tent is outside of the camp. It's not in a place that is structured and organized. And second, it turns out that people can become prophets not only at the tent, but really people can become prophets anywhere, because after all, God is all powerful. God can do what God wants to do, and God can make two people into prophets even if they're in the wrong place. And so that I think you see this idea of liminality and the breakdown of structure in the E point of view, in the E camp. We're gonna have more time for questions. I just want to first sum up where I am, and then throw a further wrench into the works. I think it's really important for us to recognize that the Torah contains both these points of view. The more dominant point of view in the Torah is the P point of view. There simply are more P verses than E verses. And so the priestly voice in the Torah emphasizes the importance of center, of structure, of permanence. It emphasizes the importance of the idea of God becoming predictable. But there is this other point of view, this ikada amre, to use an Aramaic term from the Talmud, this other way of thinking that's found in the Torah that emphasizes the periphery, that emphasizes God's freedom, and therefore God's complete unpredictability, that puts less emphasis on sacred space. And what's interesting in the Torah, for me, is that the Torah is not somewhere in between these two points of view. The Torah insists that we've got to hold on to both of these points of view at the same time. Some of you have studied with me before, and you've heard me say this about conservative Judaism, that conservative Judaism, when it's at its best, conservative Judaism is not about being in the middle. It's about being on both sides fully and simultaneously. And that's a tendency, I think, that authentic Judaism gets from the Torah itself by combining these actually 4 different documents and leaving those documents, I think, largely intact. It doesn't edit them. It doesn't change them. The Torah is full of what looks like self-contradictions. And the Torah is telling us that somehow the difficult work of being an authentic Jew is we've got to sometimes hold on to 2 different points of view at the same time. We've got to understand that God is unpredictable. We don't really know what God's will actually is. Therefore, there should be more than one authority interpreting God's will, interpreting the law. And at the same time, we've got to understand that there needs to be an authority who interprets the law in some sort of definite way, or else we don't have a religion. We've just got some sort of chaos, which is dissipating into non-existence. The Torah tells us we've got to accept that God is not predictable, and yet we also have to accept that in some respects, God has become predictable for us. We've got to accept multiple authorities, and we've got to accept the idea of one centralized authority. We've got to accept the idea that land is sacred, that there's a central place that in which holiness is present, that sacredness, sacrality inheres in that place. And we've also got to realize that that's a very dangerous idea, and an idea that we have to be very, very suspicious of, an idea that we have to temper by adding the idea that, no, there's no such thing as sacred space. Or there are many, many different places that are sacred, but they're only sacred temporarily, and we don't even know where they all were or where they all might be. Or even where they all are, perhaps even at this very, very moment. So we're getting these 2 different points of view in the Torah. The fact that we've got these 2 models of the tent, I think it's really absolutely crucial for understanding the nature of the Torah as a religious document, and for understanding the nature of Jewish religion, which is that we've got to accept 2 different models of religiosity simultaneously. It's for this reason that I'm not only talking about Mircea Eliade, but also J.Z. Smith. For Eliade, these were sort of opposites, and this one type of religion would come and replace the other type. The utopian would come to replace the locative. What I think J.Z. Smith more accurately points out is, no, they can be simultaneous. They can even exist in a single religious community. He didn't use this example, but I would say that the example of the tent of meeting and the example of the Pentateuch shows us it can even be present in a single in a single religious document, such as the Torah. One more point. that throws an interesting wrench into all this. And then I'd like to open to have more time for questions this time than we had last time. So I've talked about the P document, the priestly document, as our representative of the center point of view, the non-liminal point of view, the more structured point of view. And when you compare P's tent of meeting to E's tent of meeting, it's really clear. Yeah, P is, clearly the E and the P authors, they had read Eliade, they had read J.Z. Smith, and they made their choices, and P is over on that side. That's what happens when you read the Torah and you're comparing the P tent with the E tent. But in many ways, when you go and read the rest of the Tanakh, the rest of the Jewish Bible, you go into the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, the prophetic books, the book of Psalms, it turns out that there's another point of view out there that puts even more emphasis on the center-focused, locative, structured point of view than P does. Because some biblical texts, not all of them, but some biblical texts later in the Tanakh, in the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, in the prophets and in the writings, some of them insist that, well, not only has God come now to dwell not in the tent, but in the temple, but God's going to dwell there forever. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, when you're talking about a tent is by definition somewhat temporary, even if it's an elaborate tent. But the temple is a structure that can endure. It's made of stone, not made of wool and of leather. And it's not built in such a way as to be, as to be able to be taken apart. And an idea developed in ancient Israel that God lives in the temple that is in the city of Jerusalem, which actually, if you look at a map, is kind of centrally located within the land of Israel. God dwells in that center, and God is always going to dwell there. Now that God has come to rest, God is no longer wandering around in a tent, but God has come into the land of Israel. God will always live there. This is an idea that you can find in the first part of the book of Isaiah, also in the book of Psalms, very, very prominently, Psalm 46, Psalm 48, whole bunch of Psalms. This is an idea that actually, it's got its own name. It's known as the idea or the doctrine of the inviolability of Jerusalem, or the inviolability of Zion. You get the idea here that because God is present in that tent, because God is present in that temple, in that building will endure forever, and God will live there forever. Now, of course, in the summer of the year 586 BCE, during the month of Av, we found out that Isaiah was wrong about this one. We find out that the Psalms didn't get this right. It was not, in fact, the case that that building would endure forever, or that God would dwell there forever. But there were many pre-exilic Israelite authors who thought that was the case. When you compare the P document and the P document's memory of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, with this idea of the inviolability of Zion, and this idea that the temple is where God will dwell forever, well, at that point you realize that, well, that the priestly tent, well, it was only a tent. It was an elaborate tent, but it was just a tent. It wasn't permanent, and it wandered around. There was no one sacred space in the way that Jerusalem and Har Habayit becomes a permanent sacred space, especially for the people who believe in the inviolability of Zion. Well, for P, as God wandered through the desert, through the Sinai desert, there were different places that were temporarily holy, and then God moved on. The camp moved on. The Israelites moved on. The tabernacle was no longer there. There's no evidence the tabernacle had ever been there, and it was just some sand and rocks at that point. And so when you compare P to the P view of the tabernacle to the temple, at this point, P is a little bit more peripherally oriented, or maybe we could say P is simultaneously oriented towards center and periphery. It's got a center, a single center, but it's a center that moves around. It's a center that is more temporary. So I actually I describe P in this respect, neither as being exactly locative, nor as being utopian. I would say that P is, I play with the word locative, and I say that, well, there is a sacred center, but it's locomotive. It's moving around. There isn't just one permanent sacred center. So on the one hand, I've suggested that it's important that the Torah includes different documents that give us these two different points of view. And when we look really carefully just at the P point of view, even just the P document by itself already has this tension built in, has this both and rather than either or point of view built in. And again, I think that it's really quite important for us, if we want to try to be traditional modern Jews, for us to acknowledge that part of what makes Judaism a really, really difficult religion to live by, part of what makes Judaism in a good way something we have to work at and work out throughout our lives, is that Judaism is always both and, not either or. Judaism is a both and religion, not an either or religion. And it's really easy for us to forget one of those sides. The example that I'm using here happens to be about center versus periphery, structure versus liminality, but there are a lot of other examples we could go to. It's really easy for us to just focus on one of them and think we're being good Jews. But the hard thing about being a Jew is that you can't just focus on the one. You've got to focus on both. As Professor Heschel taught, Judaism isn't about kavanah and it isn't about keva. It's about both. It's about both having structure, keva, but also having deep interiority, a structure that comes from outside of us, but having personal intention inside of us. We could go into lots of other examples. What makes Judaism hard is that we've got to be both and what makes shallow and failed forms of Judaism so easy, and therefore so very, very common in the Jewish world, is that it's so easy to go to either or, which many Jews, alas, do. But part of being Jewish is doing the both and that I think that the Torah is telling us to do when it gives us these two different historical memories of the tent of meeting, and even that the P document by itself is telling us to do when it tells us that there is a single sacred center, and that it moves around, when it tells us that there is a central pivot and that pivot is constantly moving or wobbling. Tov, we've still got some time, so let's take questions, and I'll stop share screening if I can figure out how to do that. I can't see where to do that, so if Tani or Eli, thanks very much. Toda. So Julia, I'm guessing that there have been some questions or comments that have come in.
Yes, people are, you all are keeping me on my toes today. It's an unending flood. So that's a compliment to you, of course, Professor Sommer. I just, I want, just before I go into questions, I just want to share with everyone, I'm putting a link to our podcast page in the chat because our Chancellor Emeritus, Arnie Eisen, did a podcast series that we called Both And, for exactly the reason that you just described. And it's, I think the tagline was 250 years of conservative Judaism in 8 episodes, something like that. I think it's 8 10-minute episodes. And it's about how this all took shape and very much what you're saying. So if you like this concept and this sort of managing of the tension, then you might like the podcast as well.
By the way, if we're talking about Chancellors Emeriti, Ismar Schorsch also wrote a collection of essays published by JTS called Polarities and Balance. I think it's a great title, Polarities and Balance. It's a great description of traditional Judaism. It's a great description of conservative Judaism. And it's a great title. And then what comes after the title page is also wonderful too. So if you're looking for reading material, that's pre-internet, I think. You'd have to find the print copy, but it's another great thing that's worth reading. Okay,
great. All right, so lots of questions about the two, these two paradigms, and actually a lot of people asked, couldn't there have been two? And they asked that in a variety of ways. Maybe there was a smaller version in earlier years, and the E conception and the more elaborate P version later. Could they have been simultaneous? There's really serving two different purposes. And it's interesting, one person asked their question like this, when you were talking about the second version, the E conception of the Mishkan, could this be another tent used only by Moshe, where he judged and / taught the people, a place where God came to him and aided him in relation to the people, where Yitro saw him working so hard from morning to night. And the way this person asked the question, it actually made me realize that my whole life, I think, when I've read the different, these different these two different concepts in different texts about the Mishkan, I actually have two completely different images of them in my mind. One is the elaborate place where the sacrifices happen, and the colors and the gold and the silver and the rings, and the other place is this, sort of this place of reflection and seeking of guidance, people of Moses of God, and they don't look the same at all in my mind. Anyway, is there any possibility that that there may have been both, because you could argue that they serve very different roles?
Great question. So I think there's more than one way to answer the question. I think the answer is yes, but there's two different yes answers that are very different from each other that I'd like to give. One is, and the answers have to do with, well, when I sit down to read the Torah, when I sit down to read the Pentateuch, what are my expectations of this, of these 5 books? If one sits down and let me say there's two different expectations. One is that the Pentateuch, the Torah, is a book. The other is that the Pentateuch, the Torah, is an anthology. So let me talk about why the answer is yes in different ways for those two different expectations. If the Torah is a book, if I think that it's a unified document, whether because I reject this modern theory of JEP&D and I believe that it was written just by one author, or even that I think it may have more than one author, but these different documents were put together in such a way as to produce a unity, and that therefore we should read the Torah as a unity. Then I'm going to try to read the Torah harmonistically. When I see what appear to be contradictions, I'll try to figure out how they're not contradictions. And one could rate, I think it's very, very plausible to say, yeah, there were 2 tents. There is the big one in the middle of the camp, and that one was used as a temple where sacrifices were given. And there's also this other one outside the tent. So I think that that's a plausible answer, but it's also a little bit of a problematic answer, because the truth is they don't exactly have different purposes. They have different purposes insofar as P's tent is a temple where there's an altar, and E's tent is not a temple. There's no evidence of an altar there. But otherwise, they do have the same purpose. They are the spot where Moses goes to commune with God. And P, over and over and over again, in many, many passages that we didn't have time to look at throughout the books of Leviticus and Numbers, describes how whenever God spoke to Moses, God spoke to Moses at the tent of meeting. Once the tent of meeting went up, that was the place where divine human communication happened. Just to give one example, Numbers 7:89, Numbers chapter 7, verse 89 is a good example of that. So the idea that from P's point of view that there would be this other tent, that's not necessary. In fact, it wouldn't even be desirable. P says, no, communication happens at this one location. So to that extent, that first answer, it's possible, but I don't gravitate towards it, because I just don't read the Torah as a book. For me, the Torah is an anthology, not a book. The fact that it begins twice, when I spoke 2 weeks ago, when I talked about the 2 different ways, how it uses the opening syntax of an ancient Near Eastern creation text twice in short sequence. I think the Torah is not even claiming to be a book. It's claiming to be an anthology. And I think that we should read it as an anthology, and probably what we're getting here are 2 different memories of probably what was one institution. And yet I think it's also possible that maybe both these historical memories might have some accuracy. Maybe they're not both associated exactly with Moses, but we do have evidence from ancient Arabian religions that very small tent shrines that were usually placed on the back of a camel and were made of red leather were used by ancient Arabs, pre-Islamic Arabs. The truth is the tent, especially as described by Moses as something small, resembles those ancient small tent sanctuaries that were quite small. Even the Mishkan, the P Mishkan, because it had orot me'udamot, because it had leather that was dyed red, it does, even the big one resembles the ancient small sanctuaries. But we also have from Mesopotamia, from about the time period in which Moses should have lived, in which this thing should have been erected, we do have in particular from Babylonian language, Akkadian language documents from the city of Mari in northwestern Mesopotamia, we do have these descriptions of elaborate tents, very much like the tent of the priestly tent of meeting. I think that there were various ancient Israelite tribes and clans and proto-Israelites, including some escaped slaves from Egypt, including migrants in and refugees from Mesopotamia, including local Canaanites who might have been fleeing persecution in the lowlands of Canaan and going up into the highlands. These different groups came together to form the nation Israel, and it is possible that there was more than one Ohel Moed among these different groups. So it may be that there was just one tent, and there are different historical memories that are just vastly divergent, and we have no idea which one is more accurate. But it's also possible that there were different groups of early Israelites or proto-Israelites who had these tent shrines at a very, very, very early period of Israel's history, at the end of the Bronze Age, maybe the very, very beginning of the Iron Age, and that E and P are somewhat accurately remembering more than one of them.
That's fascinating. So it's almost, I wonder if you could say it like this, that because of these different backgrounds, right, the Mishkan or the Ohel Moed sort of occupies a place in the, in the way people talk about their history and their religion, but different people picture that differently because of where they've come from, perhaps.
Yeah. I think that's a part of it. Even if there was only one tent, what's interesting is that the Torah is preserving divergent memories of that one tent. The Torah doesn't seem to care exactly which picture is more accurate. What the history really was isn't really a concern. It's these two different perceptions of what happened, memories of what happened, which encapsulate two different types of religiosity that the Torah cares about. And the Torah gives both of them to us and doesn't tell us to make a choice between them. It just says, this is part of sacred scripture. This is part of sacred scripture. Accept it all. Accept all of it.
It's so interesting. Do you want to try to squeeze in one more really quickly?
Sure. Yeah, I'm in no rush, so I can go a few minutes over too.
I want to let people.
If people need to leave, I totally understand that. Great seeing everybody. Lots of familiar faces all over.
There were a few questions all on the question of kind of the issue of danger and seeing God. So, but let's hold it for a second and let those who need to go right now go. And thank you so much again, Professor Sommer, for this this amazing in between kind of conception. And really you've talked about two very different things in two places, but you've brought them together by saying we need to dwell in the space in between. So so thank you so much for just this really enlightening explanation. And thank you so much again to Yale Aspel for your very generous sponsorship of the session. And thank everyone for coming. And we will be back next is next week President's Day? I forget now. Whenever the next.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So after President's Day, we'll be back with Dr. Sarah Wolf, who is who teaches Talmud and Rabbinics here at JTS, and she'll be talking about kind of the actually very in its own way consistent with what Dr. Sommer was talking about today. She'll be looking at what we like to define as two really different genres, especially in rabbinic texts, of law and narrative, and also looking at do we need to define them so distinctly, or is there a space in between that we want to dwell? So we hope to see everyone back in 2 weeks. So thank you to you, Professor Sommer. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Yale once again. So that's the official end, and I will ask you one more question. And thank you for staying a little bit late.
Sure, happy to.
Okay, so, all right. So there are a few questions around danger. So, and the idea that seeing God, or touching the ark, these things are dangerous and can kill. That there's a safety to which you talked about as part of the imminence. There's a safety to having a set place, but so you did discuss it, but sort of it's I don't know, just kind of emphasizing that point about kind of the dangerousness of a lack of set place. Someone also asked about, I'll just kind of throw into that, hearkening back to your session a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned the term chaos as the outside of the camp, which of course makes us think of pre-creation and where it all started from. So I don't know, two kind of comments relating to danger and chaos, if you want to address those.
Sure. I think in the priestly version, God is dangerous and inherently unpredictable. But what the Mishkan does, the function of the Mishkan, is that the Mishkan is God's gracious gift to the nation Israel, that allows a gift in the sense that God gives the directions of how to build it right and how to work it correctly, how to operate it correctly. Even though the Israelites themselves are the ones who build it. The Mishkan is God's gracious gift to the people Israel, and through them maybe to all of humanity, that allows them to dwell among allows them to dwell alongside God. So the Mishkan takes the dangerous, unpredictable, transcendent God and renders God somewhat predictable, less dangerous, and in a sense usable. And that, on the one hand, is the great thing about the Mishkan, and it's also the thing that makes the Mishkan not physically dangerous, but religiously dangerous. Once you've got a central authority, once there are people who are officially in charge of telling us what exactly God's will is, that can easily devolve into a kind of religious tyranny, which during this particular week in the history of the state of Israel is really worth quite noting. But it can devolve into a kind of religious tyranny or theocracy, and it can devolve into a form of idolatry. And that's why I think that it's very important to realize that P also has a story that we didn't have time to get into at all in Leviticus chapters 8 through 10 about what happens during the Chanukah Mishkan, what happens during the ceremonies for inaugurating the tabernacle, in which God suddenly and pretty much inexplicably lashes out against the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, who are both struck down dead. And it's not clear that they did anything wrong. And even if they did do something wrong, it's not at all clear that they intended to do anything wrong. There are a lot of different ways of reading that story. My own take on it, in light of the whole trajectory of the creation of the Mishkan, and when we put the Mishkan into sort of this way of thinking of divine transcendence and immanence, and these two different types of religiosity that Eliade and Smith talk about, I think that that story is P's reminder that even when we have rendered God safe and predictable, the truth is that God remains incredibly dangerous and unpredictable. That even at that central location, things can go wrong. So that there again, you're seeing you're seeing P's subtlety. That even P, which initially I'm using P to represent one side of the polarity, but P is really on both sides of the polarity. And P reminds us through this tragic story of how the greatest day in the history of the world and the greatest day in the history of the nation Israel, and certainly a big day for the family of Moses and Aaron, turned into this terrible tragedy when Aaron's older two sons were killed. And all Moses was able to say was, on with the show. We have to keep on going. We cannot, we can't let this slow down what we're doing today. So God's dangerousness is tamed in the locative model, the center-oriented model. But the P text reminds us, well, no, not really. It's never fully tamed. Tov, one more follow-up, Julia, or?
Did you want to comment on the sort of outside the camp chaos related to creation?
Yeah. That's interesting. So I don't think that P is picking up on the idea, the idea that maybe outside the sanctuary or outside the camp, there is still some tohu vavohu. I think that makes a lot of sense in the Bible as a whole. That the truth is that when we go through the Bible as a whole, chaos is never fully tamed. And I think that fits what I was talking about 2 weeks ago, in that creation wasn't completely completed, and therefore creation was not fully completed. Chaos was never fully tamed, and that's why there can be these eruptions of disorder in the universe. That's why God still has to fight the forces of chaos, the Leviathan, the Leviathan, and the Tanin, the dragons, in the book of Psalms and in the book of Isaiah. That's why in the future, in Isaiah chapter 27:1, we find that God will still be fighting them far into the future, but maybe God one day will finally fully, will fully conquer them. All that having been said, I don't think that the P document, in its description of the Mishkan being located in the Midbar, in the wilderness, I don't think that the P document focuses us on the chaos theme, because it doesn't use the same vocabulary. That vocabulary of tohu vavohu, it doesn't recur later in P. I think the theme of the incompleteness of creation, that yes, God subdued chaos, but not 100%. That comes back constantly in other parts of the Tanakh. It comes back in rabbinic literature and mythological material in rabbinic literature and in Jewish mysticism. But I don't think that P in particular focuses us on that theme. And I'm just saying that vocabulary wise. It doesn't go back to that vocabulary of tohu vavohu later in the Tanakh.
I'm just, there's so many applications of what you were just saying a minute ago in terms of safety and danger in the same place. It just, just one that came to mind was, kind of all the startups who don't want to calcify into the legacy institutions, and then as they grow, they sort of see, oh, that's why there's membership. Oh, that's why you need a budget. That's why you have boards.
Right.
That there's and yet you then can calcify into an institution that doesn't grow and change. So just, I don't know, there are a lot of applications of the places where we find comfort that also can then bring their own dangers. There's kind of the sort of very lofty one that you mentioned, and then more practical ones as well.
Yeah, I think in institutions you see that all the time. Max Weber, the great sociologist and theorist, talks about this, how institutions often move from charisma to institutionalization. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But there's a danger. There's a danger in just having charisma. And, some of us have been members of, groups that were led by a chaotic person, a charismatic person. And no, there's reasons that having meetings every Tuesday actually makes sense. Institutionalization can be good, but then institutionalization brings its own dangers.
Right.
And you can, and you lose the charisma. It's finding the both and that is the hard part.
Right. The moving can be dangerous. Moving can be safe. Same with staying still.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Both and is a great place to end it. So thank you so much again for this just kind of revelatory and really nuanced teaching today. And we look forward to having you back for the next series, whatever it may be.
Great. Toda rabah. And lihitraot. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for coming again.